Hey there, everyone. I am child therapist Mr. Stu, and I am so excited to have you joining me today in a discussion about the neurotypical brain, especially in children. I have to tell you that as you hear about these different pieces of the brain, this is what the brain would be like if everything was working 100% perfectly. In other words, no one's brain actually works exactly like this. Everybody's brain has some differences. Some of those differences are very drastic and some of them are minimal, but everybody's brain operates a little bit differently. I'm hoping that today you can have a general knowledge about the different lobes in the brain and different chemicals in the brain called neurotransmitters that help organize and synthesize different pieces of information. So, with that in mind, just understanding that we'll be covering a general overview, let's jump into talking about the neurotypical brain, especially in children. I've designed a little diagram that I think helps to show just what is going on in the mind of a child. And this is what it would look like if the brain was operating 100% exactly as it is supposed to. Like I said, no one's brain is perfect like this, but let me dive into the different pieces and show you what the different parts of the brain are so that you can understand how dysfunction in one or more portions of the brain can really cause some problems. We will start with the four main lobes of the brain. The lobes are these different pieces that are divided. Here you can see that there are four main lobes. Then down here there are two other things, and we will be talking about those as well. But first I want to talk about the four main lobes. This first lobe here is called the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is the portion that most people think of when they think of the brain. They think that the whole brain does what actually this frontal lobe does. This frontal lobe is critical in decision making, planning, problem solving, and social behavior. The difficulty is that the frontal lobe doesn't actually develop in children until around age 12. So all of those skills about decision making and planning and social skills, the reason that those things are so disrupted many times in children is not due to any disorder. It's just they're not old enough to have that part of the brain, this part, the frontal lobe part, that critical decision making part, that part has not yet developed in their mind. So it's not that they are bad at decision making because they have something going on. They're bad at decision making because they're 8 years old and this part of the brain hasn't really come online yet. It's also the reason why children don't really understand sarcasm. When you tell a sarcastic joke to a child, you really have to explain it. And that's because this frontal lobe part of the brain is also the one that helps put a lot of things together and helps take an abstract concept and make it understandable. Well, children don't quite have that. And so that's why all of those things can sometimes have some real difficulties, especially in young children. If you were going to think about the brain as an orchestra or a symphony, the frontal lobe, that piece is the conductor of the symphony, and it helps direct all of the other pieces on what to do, and that's why children a lot of times have many difficulties, because that conductor is doing what they can, but they get off time quite often. Let's talk next about this piece back here, this part that has the hand and the mouth. This part of the brain is called the parietal lobe, and it has a lot to do with sensory information. It's processing that information as it comes in, especially touch and taste. If you look also, you can see that this mouth is kind of between the parietal lobe and the frontal lobe. That's because this part of the brain that has a lot to do with our taste is connected somewhat to the frontal lobe and somewhat to the parietal lobe in its own little piece. And that's why also at a certain age, many people's tastes change. And that's because the frontal lobe, again, comes online about age 12. And so it affects our taste and makes us actually desire different things as we reach a certain age. This part of the brain also is responsible for processing the sensory information, especially the sense of touch. If you were thinking of the brain as maybe a guide for you, then that parietal lobe, that piece behind the frontal lobe, it would be like the brain's GPS. It helps us navigate and make sense of the world, and it can process sensory information and then help us to kind of use that information to navigate the world around us. Let's talk next about this lobe here that has the eyeball. That lobe is called the occipital lobe. Occipital lobe back here. And it is in the back of the brain, and it has a lot to do with visual processing. A lot of sight information, most of the sight information is processed back there in the occipital lobe. And I just think it's interesting that sight has to come from the front of the brain all the way to the back, and then it's able to be processed. Our sight is not right there next to our eyeballs, and that's just kind of interesting to me. But another interesting fact about the occipital lobe, many times in television shows and movies, someone will see someone that they find attractive, and what will happen is they'll get like a and they'll be asked, "What is your name?" And they can't bring that information. They can't get the answer out. And the reason is that actually does happen a bit, because when you see someone you find attractive, then what happens is a lot of brain function goes from wherever it is to the occipital lobe to process the information you're taking in. So most of it is stuck back there, and you aren't able to get to those memories about what your name might be. And maybe that's an extreme example, but really so much energy goes to the back of your brain that the frontal lobe, where all of that processing is located, it kind of gets weaker because everything went to the occipital lobe. So that is the part of the brain that has a lot to do with visual processing. You can think of this lobe as your brain's personal artist. It paints vivid pictures from the colors, shapes, and movements that we see. Let's talk now about the next part of the brain. It is this part in the middle here that has the ear and the nose, and part of the almond is there as well. This part of the brain is called the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe. And it has a lot to do with processing auditory information. There's also a portion of this lobe that has a lot to do with processing the sense of smell. And this is also where memory happens. Memory forms here, and many memories are stored here. Just a fun fact about the temporal lobe and its function in the brain: the reason why music can bring back so many memories is because the part of the brain that processes sound is located right next to the part that has a lot to do with memory. Part of the brain that processes the sense of smell is also close to the part of the brain that has a lot to do with memory. That's why music and smells can help trigger memories so frequently in the brain. This would be your brain's personal sound engineer. It can tune into the world's soundtrack and store it for later so that you can get back to it whenever you'd like. Let's talk next about the two pieces down here at the bottom of the brain. This part with the scale and this part with the heart rate monitor. The part with the scale here is called the cerebellum. The cerebellum has a lot to do with balance and movement. It can also help you find your place in space and your place in relationship to other things around you. That's the cerebellum. Then there's this piece right here that has the heart rate monitor. That is a portion of the brain that's called the brain stem. You may have heard of the brain stem because it connects to the spinal cord and has a lot to do with heart rate, digestion, respiration, breathing, and it is like the brain's autopilot. It takes care of all the things that we don't consciously think about. All of those things that just happen on their own, that's the brain stem's job. And that's also why if you sever the top of your spinal cord, you can't survive, because you can no longer be connected to that part of you that is keeping you going. That is the main lobes of the brain here, with the frontal lobe that has a lot to do with problem solving and processing of a bunch of information all at once. Then we have the parietal lobe. This one has a lot to do with processing sensory information, taste and touch especially. Then the occipital lobe. This is the lobe that does the most for our visual processing. The temporal lobe here has a lot to do with our auditory processing, our olfactory sense, the sense of smell, and memory. Then back here we have the cerebellum that helps a lot with balance and movement. And then finally the brain stem that helps regulate all of those things that happen automatically. Finally, I want to talk about this little almond here between the brain stem and the temporal lobe. This almond here is a portion of the brain that's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is about the size of an almond. That's why I've chosen an almond as the picture there. But that amygdala is like the body's smoke detector. Anytime the brain starts to bring in information that makes it nervous, the amygdala triggers a response for the brain to react. And the brain can react in all kinds of different ways, but that amygdala is the thing that's responsible. As we talk about different disorders, especially anxiety disorders and PTSD, keep the amygdala in mind as that smoke detector, that alarm that goes off anytime the brain is sensing something that it feels may be dangerous. So keep the amygdala in your mind, but don't worry about it. Don't let the alarm go off just yet. The amygdala is nothing to fear, and we'll get back to it soon. For now, it is like the brain's smoke detector, and it causes the brain to respond in different ways anytime it feels like something may be dangerous. It sets off an alarm, and the brain reacts in various ways to what it believes could be a threat. Keep that in mind, especially as we discuss anxiety and PTSD, because the amygdala plays a very important role in those disorders. Now, let's talk about these things off to the side. They are called neurotransmitters, and they have critical roles in helping transmit signals across the brain. They help different pieces of the brain to work together. In adults, the frontal lobe can do that a lot. The frontal lobe can synthesize information and process it and really help bring things together. Well, in children, because they don't have this frontal lobe, what does help is play, because play engages touch, sight, sound, smells, sometimes taste, and sometimes that can mean chewing on different toys. Maybe that's appropriate, maybe it's not, but it can help synthesize all those pieces, because all of those pieces are having to work together to accomplish a task. Well, the way that those pieces of the brain work together are through these neurotransmitters, these things that cause different parts of the brain to work together and respond in various ways. we're going to talk about each one of the neurotransmitters, what they do in the brain, and then a quick example of what might happen if that neurotransmitter is out of balance in the brain. So let's dive into dopamine. Dopamine, you can see up here, is this neurotransmitter that has the trophy with it. And the reason I chose a trophy as the picture for dopamine is because dopamine has a lot to do with reward. If the brain senses something that is positive and it feels good, dopamine is released. Dopamine is that chemical that just makes you feel good. It also has a lot to do with motivation. If you're in a competition, you want to win the trophy. Motivation. It also has some to do with pleasure, the things that do feel good and the things that don't feel good. And an increase in dopamine can also help with motor control. Dopamine is like the brain's cheerleader. It encourages us and children to repeat behaviors that bring joy. This is why positive consequences happen, why positive consequences work, because you're giving a burst of dopamine. Hey, you did that so well, here's a sticker. Oh, you did that so great, here's a high five. Oh my goodness, look at you, you are so creative. Even just that word of affirmation gives a burst of dopamine. And so that chemical, that neurotransmitter, is what gets released anytime you're getting something that you like. That's why children will continue to do behaviors that release that burst of dopamine, even if those behaviors seem counteractive. Also, dopamine plays a critical role in depression and in ADHD. You'll see that in both of those disorders, dopamine is decreased in the brain. It has a lower level than a neurotypical brain. And so it has a difficulty with some of that motivation and some of that pleasure and some of that appreciating different rewards. The next neurotransmitter that we're going to talk about is this one here, and it's called serotonin. Serotonin is a part of a neurotransmitter in the brain that has a lot to do with our sleep and wake cycle, and it has a key influence on our mood, our appetite, and a few other functions. Serotonin is like our brain's comfort blanket. It can help us feel calm and happy and stable. That balance of serotonin just helps our mood to stay kind of on this steady path or steady stream. It also allows us to fall asleep when we want or need to and wake up when we want or need to. It also plays a critical role in an increase or a decrease or just the right amount of appetite. When it's in balance, it is that comfort blanket. It's just that contentment that just everything feels fine. The next neurotransmitter that we're going to talk about is this one here that has the needle with the heart with the flame on it. This one is called norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is a key neurotransmitter in what's called the body's fight or flight response. It's involved in arousal, attention, and mood regulation. Norepinephrine is kind of like a steroid in the brain that helps fuel other reactions. You'll see that in anxiety disorders, there's an overabundance of norepinephrine that causes that amygdala to get a little out of whack, and it triggers one of the ways that the brain can react when it senses fear is what's called a fight or flight response, that you'll either run towards the thing that is scaring you and you'll try to take it over, or you'll run away from the thing. And children can demonstrate that behavior in all sorts of different ways, even if it's not physical fights or physically running away. And so norepinephrine has a lot to do with anxiety disorders as well. It's involved in that fight or flight response, and it has a lot to do with that amygdala, the brain's alarm system. It can fuel the amygdala to go off and sound the alarm whenever it thinks that danger is near, to help keep us alert. That steroid sensation in the brain causes you to have this burst of maybe energy or burst of just hypervigilance across your surroundings, all due to norepinephrine. The next neurotransmitter that we'll talk about is called GABA for short. I'm going to be honest with you, I learned how to say this a few weeks ago. I think I can get it. Let me try it, and then you can let me know in the comments if this is the right way to say this word. Gamma amino butyric acid, I think. Gamma amino butyric acid. You let me know down in the comments, did I just say that right? If I did, fantastic. And make sure you like and subscribe this video. But let's talk about GABA and its role in the brain. You can see that the picture I chose for this neurotransmitter is this traffic guard. And that's because GABA, gamma amino butyric acid, I think, is the brain's peacekeeper. It helps reduce that excitement in the brain and maintains a healthy balance of brain activity. Anytime there's overstimulation, GABA can do its job by regulating that stimulation and not allowing the brain to become overly excited. It is the brain's peacekeeper, ensuring that every part of the brain stays calm and doesn't get too overly excited. You'll see that in some of the disorders, an imbalance in this gamma amino butyric acid or GABA has a lot to do with an ability to regulate either hyperactivity, or sometimes it has a lot to do with an inability to regulate mood, or an inability to regulate different behaviors, all because that GABA is not in balance. It is imbalanced. That's GABA, the brain's peacekeeper. It helps make sure that everything kind of stays where it's supposed to be. Oh, you know what? This would be a great example of this. Gamma amino butyric acid, GABA, is like the lunk alarm at Planet Fitness. It is the thing that says like, oh, well, hey, whoa, too much. You slammed that. You grunted too loud. I'm not sure what I think about all that, but it's the brain's lunk alarm. It says, hold on, wait, you got a little too into that. So slow down just a bit. It helps regulate all of those things in the brain. Let's move on. Let's talk next about this neurotransmitter here. This one is called glutamate. And glutamate has a lot to do with memory formation in the brain. Let me try to explain it. Glutamate is responsible for allowing different parts of the brain to talk to each other, basically. That means that if you are taking in some sound and sight and touch, and all of those things are forming one picture, glutamate is the thing that's allowing all of those connections to happen. Because it's great at making connections, glutamate is also responsible for forming memories in the brain, deeply ingrained, because it can connect that memory to so many different pieces. So it strengthens that memory in the brain because it can be recalled from many different senses or many different thoughts because it's so ingrained and so connected. Glutamate is what causes those connections to happen. In certain disorders, glutamate can get overly excited, and it can cause a condition in the brain that makes there be too much chaos going on all at once, and it's hard to be sorted. A decrease in glutamate can cause different parts of the brain to not cooperate with each other very well. So glutamate is like your average college student. It's a scholar that loves to learn, but too much excitement and it becomes a wild party animal, because glutamate loves to form those connections and really deeply ingrained memories. We'll talk about more about what can happen if glutamate gets imbalanced throughout different discussions of various disorders. Let's talk about the final main neurotransmitter in the brain. This neurotransmitter is called cortisol. Cortisol is often referred to as the stress hormone because it helps the body respond to stress. It also plays a part in controlling blood sugar levels, regulating your metabolism, and reducing inflammation. Cortisol is like our body's built-in alarm clock. It's highest in the morning to help us wake up and starts to decrease throughout the day to prepare us for sleep. Cortisol is a completely healthy chemical, even though it may be called the stress hormone. Cortisol does increase in the brain when there is an increase in stress. Now, the difficulty can come if the brain is under too much stress for too long. It can build up too much cortisol in the brain, and that can cause all kinds of dysfunction, from difficulty sleeping to difficulty waking up. It can lead to depression and anxiety, and cortisol is a neurotransmitter that we'll be covering a lot in the various videos about the brain disorders. Okay, let's put it all together. We started our discussion by talking about this portion of the brain here, the frontal lobe, that has a lot to do with synthesizing information. It also is the part of the brain that helps with problem solving and abstract thinking and being able to understand abstract thought. This part of the brain is not well developed in children under the age of 12, and that's why many times they have difficulty with those things that the frontal lobe helps with, because theirs isn't fully online yet. Then we talked about the parietal lobe, this part of the brain that has a lot to do with sensory processing, especially the senses of touch and taste. The parietal lobe processes that information and helps connect it to different parts of the brain for storing as a memory or signaling danger or any of the other various tasks of the brain. Then back here, we talked about this eyeball piece, the occipital lobe. And the occipital lobe helps to process visual information, and it helps to process that visual information. That's its main job. Then in the middle here, we talked about the temporal lobe. It has a lot to do with our mood and memory and processing sound and smell. We talked about the cerebellum and how it plays a major role in our balance and motor coordination. Then we talked about the brainstem and the brainstem's role in regulating all of those things that happen naturally. It's the brain's autopilot. And we discussed how the amygdala is like the brain's fire alarm. It goes off anytime it senses danger. Dopamine is the brain's reward chemical. It is produced in the brain anytime the brain feels something good and rewarding. We talked about serotonin, how serotonin is like the brain's comfort blanket, the weighted blanket that just feels so good and helps to regulate appetite and mood and sleep patterns when it is in balance. We talked about norepinephrine, this neurotransmitter that is like a steroid in the brain and especially fuels this amygdala alarm system, and how an increase in norepinephrine can cause an increased reactivity in this alarm system. We'll go more into that as we discuss different disorders, especially anxiety. We talked about GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, I think, and how it is the brain's peacekeeper. It helps to keep everything in order. It is the brain's lunk alarm that says, hey, you got a little too excited, let me help you calm down. We talked about glutamate and glutamate's role in connections in the brain and how it helps to synthesize different information, and how children can use glutamate in their brain to synthesize information through play because it activates so many of the senses and causes them to work together. Glutamate also plays a key role in autism spectrum disorder, and we'll discuss that in that video. And finally, we discussed cortisol, the brain's stress hormone, and that chemical that is released and perfectly healthy when it is in balance, but can get out of whack if the brain is under too much stress or stress for too long. I hope that now you feel at least a general basic knowledge and a shared vocabulary about the neurotypical brain. If right now you're thinking, oh my goodness, I did not understand that, take a deep breath. It's okay. When you go to whichever brain you're wanting to learn more about, the disordered brains, then you can learn a quick recap of the information we covered in this video, and then we'll dive in to the disordered brain and how it functions differently than a neurotypical brain. Also, you can head over to MisterStuTV.com. You can download this diagram of the neurotypical brain, and you can get a refrigerator sheet there that covers some of the basic information that we discussed and highlights some of the key portions of the brain and how you can know what's going on in your child's brain. Be sure to check out all of the disordered videos and make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the mental health fun, resources, and training. I will see you again very soon. Till then, spread the word, share the love. Bye-bye.